So it's a great pleasure to introduce the two speakers today. And first of all, Julio Pinto, Professor of History at the Universidad de Santiago de Chile, very distinguished historian, I would say one of the most distinguished historians of Latin America. He was awarded the Premio Nacional de Historia in 2016, and he has written many books, including the book that we are going to be discussing today, Caudillos y plebeyos, la construcción social del Estado en América del Sur, Argentina, Perú, Chile, which was published in 2020 by LOM. Among some of the other publications that you've probably read of Julio's, there are Trabajadores y Rebeldía en la Pampa Salitrera, 1998, and Chilenos Todos, la construcción social de la nación, 2008. Natalia Sobrevilla is a professor of Latin American history at the University of Kent, and she is the author of, again, several books, including The Caudillo of the Andes, Andrés de Santa Cruz, 2011, and more recently, Los Inicios de la República, Viendo Más Allá de la Cueva de los Bandoleros, 2019. So it's really great to have Julio and Natalia here to discuss a book that I don't know if it's circulating here in England. I hope it will soon, but I think you'll find it's a book that is going to give us plenty to think about. So I'm going to turn over now to Natalia and to Julio and let them run the show.
Thank you, Paulo, and thank you, Julio, for accepting the invitation and for giving us this wonderful opportunity to discuss this great book. It's a real privilege for me to get to read it and to ask some questions and to reflect. So I'm just going to start with a little introductory question about what brought you to this comparative aspect, which is actually not very usual to be done in this way from a historical perspective. I mean, there's been a lot of comparative works, but they tend to be, as you note in the introduction to the book, they tend to be more historical sociology or political science that tends to look at models. But very few historians of the 19th century tend to go into this kind of comparative work that goes deep into the archive, deep into the historiography. So what motivated you to go and ask these general questions and to think about a comparative between these three different models? What was it really that brought you to that question?
Well, let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Christine Macias, to Natalia and to Paulo for the invitation. It's really an honor for me to be speaking about my book before so distinguished an audience as the one that has congregated here today, and no less than in the United Kingdom. It's pretty unheard of to be presenting a book thousands of kilometers away from my own country and my own city. So that to begin with. Second, I would ask you to be patient and with my English. It's become a little rusty after several decades of not speaking it constantly. And it's been quite a while since I last attended an academic meeting where I had to actually speak in English. So I appeal to your sense of pity and understanding regarding my English, and also confessing that it feels a little funny communicating with Natalia and with Paulo in a language which is different from our own, and which is also the one in which we normally conduct our conversations. So also share that feeling with you. And now going to Natalia's, directly to Natalia's question, This began as a research on my own country, on Chile. And one of the books that Paulo mentioned, which is called Chilenos Todos, in question mark, had to do with the mystery, in a sense, to me, that a country where social differences were so deep, where social hierarchies were so deeply imprinted in daily interaction, especially in the 19th century, but also today, was able to build, to generate such a strong sense of nationality, on the one hand, which went through it was pretty widespread, socially speaking. It was a sense that was, in a sense, appropriated by the popular classes, and also such a strong state for 19th century standards, which managed to, in a sense, exercise a significant degree of hegemony regarding the rest of the society. So this to me was sort of a mystery, because I had been studying Chilean history in late 19th, early 20th centuries. And what you saw there was permanent conflict and social rift, which was very, very evident, and which, in a sense, defined the functioning of social relations and politics in turn of the century Chile. So my question was how we start from a situation in the colony where social hierarchies were very deeply imprinted, and where there was no sense of Chile as a community of any sorts. Then you go through the 19th century in a process where you have a very early consolidation, both of the nation and of the state. And then towards the end of the century, again, you find a very conflictual scene, which in a sense puts into question what happened before. So that's how I started asking myself, how was this done? How did this come about? How did the elites who, in a sense, conducted this process manage to obtain the acquiescence, or maybe even in some cases, the active support of other sectors of the population, especially the popular groups, in order to build in a pretty quick manner, a pretty, if not necessarily, not at all democratic, but at least very efficient nation state that was accepted and followed by most of the population. So I began with this study, which focused only on Chile. And then I began to ask myself the next question: how did this happen in other parts of the continent? So I managed to obtain funding, when I have to acknowledge this, because without those funds, which were given by our national research, scientific research institution, I couldn't have done this research. I remember speaking to Natalia in Lima, and she was saying to me how she felt, of course, a healthy jealousy, because she couldn't have done that working from Peru and going to other countries. But in my case, I was fortunate enough to obtain the support. So I was able to work in Argentinian and Peruvian archives. I began with Argentina because I sensed that there were two early state building experiences, which were what in Chile we call the Diego Portales regime, after the person who, in a sense, led this process of state building, a very authoritarian and socially very repressive regime. And at the same time, in Argentina, exactly at the same time, we had the Rosas dictatorship, the Rosas regime, which was pretty much following the same agenda: pacify the country, bring different social actors under stricter discipline, carry out some sort of political unification and begin the construction of the state. But my feeling from general readings was that in order to achieve that result, Rosas pursued a much more, how could I call it, inclusive strategy. In the case of Portales, this is fairly well known in Chile, the strategy of state building was very authoritarian, top-down, and very repressive regarding the rest of the social actors, especially popular actors. So the state was constructed through a strategy that was very concentrated on the exertion of force. But in Buenos Aires, rather than Argentina, because as you know, Argentina did not coalesce into a more unified nation until later in the 19th century. But at least in the province of Buenos Aires, Rosas was carrying out a very similar agenda, but in a much more, how could I put it, much more negotiated strategy regarding its own popular sectors. So I contrasted these two experiences, and then I decided to add in a third one, just for the sake of being sure what was common and what was different. And then I thought about Peru and the regime of Ramon Castilla, which is a little later in time, but which, at least a priori, I felt that exhibited the same basic traits of social pacification, state building, and the construction of some sort of hegemony within the country. And that's how I arrived at my three cases. And then I went about comparing the three of them and see in what they resembled each other and in what they differed. And I put this all under a theoretical umbrella, which I called the social construction of the state, or the social building of the state, which had to do with strategies that elites, ruling elites, applied to the society to bring the popular groups into this project, be it by force, by negotiation, by seduction, or whatever, and see what the results of those parallel but different strategies turned out to be. I think that sort of puts us into the into the framework of what I tried to do with this book.
Great, Julio. Thank you so much. As I said before, and you've now given a little bit more about, it's a great thing to find this kind of comparative study, because I find that very often when we study the 19th century especially, we tend to just narrow onto the nation. When we study the previous era, particularly the wars of independence, we tend to be more open into the comparisons. But one of the things that I found really striking was that your hypothesis was informed by the different experiences of the wars of independence and how these hierarchical societies had to coalesce around new arrangements. And one of the things that I found really interesting about the book was this focus that you had on the subaltern sectors and trying to understand what were the mechanisms used by these different regimes to create some kind of order. And also very usefully remind us that in Chile, which we often see as this example of order and success, there were also two important civil wars in the 1850s, which are often forgotten when we think about the success, because these revolutions were unsuccessful, so the order was maintained. So a lot of our colleagues who have done work on subaltern sectors have tended to go the other direction that you have, by looking at a very regional way and understanding the very small thing. But one of the things that struck me as very useful in this kind of wider, broader look is that you look at three societies that are quite different. In Peru, the issue of Afro-Peruvians and indigenous people is very important. In Argentina, the population is very different as well, but there's the Afro-Argentine relationship with Rosas and his relationship with the Indios Amigos. Whereas in Chile, the control of the elites is much stronger. So in terms of these views that you have from, because you look at the elites on one level and you look at the subalterns and you look at how they interact. So theoretically, in the theory that you're using, you're very interested in how it is that elites either co-opt or control these subaltern groups, but you also pay a lot of attention of their agency as well. So I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit more about these different experiences in the three cases that you focus on this relationship in the elites, intra-elites, and between the subaltern groups and the elites, and how this comparison illuminated things for you.
Okay, first let me say that I think that all countries emerging out of the independence wars face pretty much the same problems and the same situations. I mean, we have a generalized pattern of political and societal breakdown, basically. And also ruling group fragmentation. I mean, the collapse of the Spanish monarchy, at least the Spanish Empire in America, and the independence wars basically turned the entire workings of the colonial system upside down. And so the main challenge that was faced by the ruling groups in all Hispanic America were analogous. They were basically similar. How do we bring this chaotic situation back under control? And this implied both solving some way or another the differences and the antagonisms within the ruling groups themselves, and also with the rest of the society. This is what seems to me lies behind the decades of political turmoil, social instability, and economic breakdown that is faced by all our countries at the same time. So although, as you very rightly say, the social settings are very different from one place to another, the challenge that was faced by the groups that were trying to reimpose some sort of order into Hispanic American society were similar. So that gave me a starting point to carry out the comparison. Because in order to do comparative history, you have something, you have to have something common to compare with. Otherwise, you're just throwing together situations or processes that maybe don't have any significant points of contact. So I started out from the premise that there was this common challenge, and that the solution to this challenge, which in the book I, in a sense, label under the category of restoration of order. Most of these regimes or regime projects had in common the goal of restoring order, political order and social order. And that, of course, implied through some means dealing with the subaltern groups, as we say, who had also been, in a sense, activated politically and socially by the wars of independence, because they had participated in the armies or because they had been summoned as political actors, something that mainly did not happen during the colonial period. So you have a subaltern world composed of different actors, of course, that is very active and very demanding, and oftentimes following their own agendas, which has to be brought into this agenda somehow. And the instruments with which you could do this depended on the situation. Sometimes you could just impose a new order, which is pretty much what happened in Chile. But in other situations, the the disintegration of traditional society was so deep, and the rifts between the ruling groups were so important that elite groups had to be fighting each other, and at the same time trying to bring the subaltern groups into some sort of acquiescence or order. And there you had to negotiate. You didn't have the possibility of just imposing rules that were not going to be accepted or tolerated even by these actors. And I think that is what makes the main difference. In Chile, the solution was much more, as I say, top-down, authoritarian, repressive. In Buenos Aires, in Argentina, someone like Rosas, who also asked the Chilean ruling groups from the traditional aristocracies, and who were not native-born populists, to maybe impose a category that might be a little bit anachronistic, but I think it saves me a lot of explanation. Rosas did not spontaneously inclinate towards a strategy of negotiation with the popular groups, but he was forced to by the situation of those groups who had been mobilized, activated by the independence wars, and who would just not meekly accept the position of an order that it didn't, to some degree, accept. So in that case, the relationship that was established between the Rosas group and the different subaltern actors was much more horizontal, and much more sensitivity was displayed by the government regarding the demands, the characteristics, even the culture of those subaltern groups. And I find that in the Peruvian case, you have sort of an intermediate solution. You have elements, more elements of coercion than in the Rosas case, but Castilla and his group had to negotiate to a much larger degree with popular groups than the case of Chile. So I have like three different outcomes, starting from a similar departure, which was how do we restore order to this society.
Great. And when you look at those different ways in which this happens, to what degree do you think that this is also the result of just the composition of these societies? So to what degree do you think that it was easier for elites in Chile to impose their order because of the type of population they had and where it was located? Whereas in Buenos Aires, you see also that Rosas's relationship with those subaltern supporters changes, and that challenges him and eventually leads to his demise. Whereas Castilla also changes. He first isn't that interested or in need of negotiation, but then when he wants to return to power, he kind of uses these. So to what degree the local realities of the places that are different are going to be important for the outcomes?
I say that they are decisive, that the nature of the outcome emanates out of these differences in the traditions, the cultures, and the social, economic, structures that are characteristic of each country or each region. I would start by saying that in the case of Chile, the ruling groups were much more closely knit than in the other two cases. Although there were differences and rivalries and antagonisms within the Chilean ruling groups, and as you remembered a little while ago, we had civil wars up until the 1850s and even later. And these were intra-elite wars. And before that, political turmoil was pretty common, as common as in Argentina or Peru. I mean, this image of Chile as as we say in Spanish, a taza de leche, a cup of milk, a place where nothing happens, or there's no disturbance, is totally undeserved. It might have been a little more true of later periods, but not of these initial decades of independent life. So in Chile, the ruling groups were much more tightly knit. They had differences, but they managed to resolve them earlier on. And so you have a united elite that is displaying an agenda of restoration and state formation over a subaltern world that has to face a united front. This is very different in Argentina and in Peru, where the intra-elite rivalries and antagonisms were much deeper, were much more complex, and lasted much longer. That is why you still have civil wars and political instability to a very significant degree till much later in the century. So in the case of Rosas, this is very clear. He has to resort to what I call in the book plebeian allies, even to stay in power, when confronting other elite groups who the only thing they want is to get him out of power. And in some of the most severe crises that Rosas has to face during his 25 or so years in power, originated in other elite groups that were trying to overthrow him. And he managed to hold on to power in great degree, in great measure, thanks to popular support. And his most loyal and most effective allies were the Afro-Argentinian population in the city of Buenos Aires, the peasant population in the countryside, and the indigenous groups in the frontier, who fought for him against his enemies who were part of the elite. And in Peru, well, you know this better than I know, the fragmentation of the elites along different lines, regional, social, whatever, were also very profound, very deep, and they continued well into the second half of the century. So again, Castilla was forced, in a sense, to pay more attention to popular demands than his counterparts in Chile did. But as you say, this changed over time. In the case of Castilla, what I find is that during the first decade of his of the Castillista period, which is, well, you know this better than I do, is 2 decades long. In the first decade, Castilla was not particularly sensitive to popular demands, except for the indigenous groups, who were the majority of the population at that time, but who also were the main support of the state finances. I mean, until the guano boom consolidated, the fisc, the state coffers in Peru depended to a great degree on the indigenous tribute contribution. No? So he could not antagonize that segment of the population without major consequences, and pretty dire for him. But then Castilla leaves power, and to return, he has to fight a very complicated civil war, and he resorts to alliances with popular sectors, again, the indigenous groups, but also the Afro-Peruvian groups. And one of the measures he takes is the abolition of slavery, which brings him a very deep and sustained and long-lasting loyalty and support from the Afro-Peruvian population. So there are situations in these countries which emanate from their previous social makeups and their previous traditions that, in a sense, force these different power groups to behave in different manners and to innovate and transform their practices and their strategies along the way. Let me, just to finish, say that none of these were Democrats. None of these caudillos or ruling groups were pursuing a democratic agenda. They were anxious to bring all the population into the decision-making process and into the political citizenship. But because of the situation in which they found themselves, they had to improvise, innovate, and establish alliances which in more in calmer circumstances, probably they wouldn't have had to.
Great, Julio. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask a final question for you to elaborate a little bit more on the book, and then I'm going to open up for all the audience's questions. My final question has to do, it's kind of a two-part question, it's interrelated. So a lot of the things that you look at, elections, armies, national guards, civil wars, confrontations, a lot of these things have become more and more understood in the countries that you've been studying. So the question is two-sided, is were you interested in these particular forms of participation, or was it more that this is the historiography that you found on these periods? It's kind of a chicken or egg thing. Was it that this is what you were looking for, or is this something that you found? Because it's quite interesting to see that in the three cases, it's quite similar what you find in terms of political participation, participation in the armies, and how do you evaluate that in terms of the three different historiographies that you've encountered for your project?
Well, let me say that I couldn't have carried out this project if it hadn't been for that historiography that you're alluding to, which has been growing exponentially for the past 3 decades. When I began to study Latin American history several decades ago, the common image was that the popular groups, the subaltern groups, had no participation at all in these processes, and that they were merely passive onlookers of the conflicts that were pitting different elite groups against each other, or people who had been forced into these different camps without much, possibility of having their own say in the matter. And this image has been, I would say, absolutely shattered by the last 3 or 4 decades of research, where different monographic studies, to which you also alluded, in all the countries of the region, have been, it has been demonstrated that was not the case, that the subaltern actors were permanently acting, as the word implies, and had been very much a part, and not a passive, but a very active component of these processes. And again, the reasons had nothing to do with the good feelings of the elites, or their philanthropy, or their democratic convictions, which I don't think ran very deep in most cases, but with the concrete, material, political constraints of the moment. I mean, you have here a continent that has been part of an imperial system which collapses, and this turns society upside down, and you have all this jockeying to see what comes out of that, and the elites, of course, try to hold on to power, but they don't have a very easy job in doing that. So there was all this literature on subaltern agency in the process of state and nation building immediately after the independence. So in a sense, my intention was not to add more knowledge to that, but to take, in a sense, advantage of that accumulation of knowledge, and to look at the problem from the other end, from the top, if you want. See, how did these groups who eventually gave shape to the South American states interact with the popular actors in order to solve the dilemmas they found themselves confronted with, and to restore a minimum of order in their countries to start building states and nations. And because we're talking about a period where the state was still very precarious, very incipient, the instruments, the tools these power groups had at their disposal were not that many, because the state still was very small, very poor. The didn't have a resource base that allowed them to carry out very ambitious plans. So they had to make do with what was at their disposal, which were, as you said, national militias, armies, and also the new political the instruments that the Republican system afforded them, which had to do with elections and had to do with some sort of recognition of citizenship, so that the population would feel, at least potentially, summoned to be part of a wider project and to be recognized as political actors in their own right. So, as you say, the challenge was common, was the same. The tools at their disposal were basically the same, and they had to see what they could do with what little they had to achieve their aims, but facing social actors, popular actors who were very different from one another.
Great, thank you so much, Julio. I'll pass the baton back to Paulo so he can help us organize the questions, and you can ask them via the chat or you can ask them by raising your hand. Please go ahead.
Yep. Who would like to go first? No one? Angela? Yep. You just need to unmute. There you go.
Okay. Bueno, primero felicitaciones, Julio. And as you said, it's very strange to ask you a question in English when we can always talk in Spanish. I really look forward to read the book. And as Natalia mentioned, this idea of a more transnational and comparative approach. I have three questions, and I hope they're small, but one, I would like to know more about the sources you work with. You mentioned the archives in Peru, in Argentina, and in Chile, and I really want to know what kind of archives you use in Chile, especially to study subaltern and popular groups. Second, I'm curious about how this, to what extent this participation was limited to the nation, or whether they move outside the nation, to what extent the popular groups perceive themselves, or when they start perceiving themselves as part of the nation, or they challenge those frontiers and those borders. And last, maybe it's part of that, if there was any international connection, whether they influence each other in these cases, whether there was any sort of dialogue or any sort of communication between these three different examples, where we can talk about a more regional connection in any sense. So that's it.
Okay, thank you, Angela. The sources, well, because I was looking at state building or state making, my sources were basically state sources, which meant the ministries, which meant the regional governments, which in Chile we call intendencias, but in Peru would be the prefecturas. Also, and you find much more about popular actors in those sources than you would think beforehand, because since these authorities were trying to build some sort of a political order in which popular actors were considered, they had to be constantly in dialogue with those actors, be it a more violent dialogue, imposing law, imposing order, or whatever, forcing people to pay taxes, or trying to cajole them or to persuade them to be part of, I don't know, National Guards, armies, in order to carry out the agendas that the state was trying to make. So the state archives gave me much more information than I thought they would have before I began the research. And even though we're talking about a very early period in the formation of the state, the presence of the subaltern actors is very intense. In the case of Argentina, I was very lucky because there is this one fondo, I don't know how you call it in English, which is called Secretaría de Rosas, which is because Rosas was such an authoritarian ruler, and he was obsessed with controlling every detail and every element of the workings of the state. He had this one big office that worked 24 hours daily with several secretaries, and bringing together all kinds of different documents, from individual petitions emanating from communities or for individuals even, who were asking the government for favors or whatever. The private correspondence of Rosas is in that collection. His correspondence with the managers of his estates, for example, and there you have wonderful information about the kinds of problems that these managers were having to face in trying to keep down a very unruly working population. And the other thing that the Rosas regime had, which was very unique, I didn't find it in Chile or Peru, was an obsession with classifying the population. Because Rosas was constantly trying to keep people in arms. His government was permanently assailed by enemies. He was always trying to recruit the population into the army. And so he had individual registers of every male inhabitant of the province, registered, giving all kinds of information, age, occupation, where they were from, parents, whether they had problems with the law before or not. So it was this one collection, Secretaría de Rosas, was really a gold mine, which made my life researching the Argentinian part of my project much easier. In the case of Peru, the sources were very rich as well, but they have, from my point of view, because I was traveling there to do the research, one problem, which is that they are not centralized. To study the archives of Cusco, you have to go to Cusco. You have to study the papers of Arequipa. You have to go to Arequipa. In Lima, you have the central state, but the central state was still very, very weak, so they didn't have that much control over the rest of the country. On one hand, it was very fortunate because I got to travel a lot and stay in different places, but it also made it much more expensive and much more difficult to administrate. I have to say now that I'm here that in all this endeavor, in the Peruvian leg of my trip, my journey, Natalia was an invaluable aid, because it was she who told me where to go, where to look, and without her monitoring, I just couldn't have done this. But so thanks to Natalia, publicly and formally. So the least of my problems was the availability of sources. There is a lot of sources. In the case of Chile, obviously, I was able to work much longer time, so I could accumulate more information. In the case of Argentina or Peru, I was restricted to shorter trips. So I think I only dented superficially the sources that were available there, but it was enough to let me know that there's a lot of information that one has to gather. The problem is to bring it together and organize it so that you can make comparisons. I spent almost 10 years in this project, and I could have spent another 10 years, but I felt that at one point you have to make it stop. That with regard to sources. The question of the nation is a very good one, because we're still at a period where the subaltern groups in particular don't have a very concrete or defined sense of the nation, especially in countries like Argentina, where there was no nation. I mean, the point of reference of the subaltern actors was their province. Their provinces were their nations. So when they were asked, what nation are you from? They would say Entre Rios, Santa Fe, Córdoba. The idea of Argentina was still very abstract. And it was an idea that was mostly in the heads of the ruling groups, not of the subaltern population. And in Peru, again, it varies, but I mean, in Lima and in the coastal areas close to the center, and in the bigger cities, you did have a much clearer sense of the nation, even among subaltern groups. When a city like Arequipa was a very explosive socially and politically city. Sarah Saunders has studied that very well. Sarah Chambers, I said Sarah Saunders. And you find that the subaltern actors were very conscious that they were part of a nation that was called Peru, but again, with very strong separatist feelings. So to make a very complex question short, I would say that the only sectors of the population where the idea of a nation was more ingrained at that time of history were the elites. I mean, they were building a nation. It was part of the project. But in the case of the subaltern groups, the idea of a nation was much weaker, much more diffused, and in many cases, non-existent. But the state, in a sense, embodied the nation for them. And to the extent that the state was able to impose some sort of a political order, the existence of the nation began to look a little more concrete for these other actors. And when there were foreign wars, which happened at the time of Santa Cruz, for example, going for the Chilean soldiers to fight to Peru, although it was a very unpopular war in Chile at the popular basis, the fact of being in a different country with different customs and different everything made it a little more concrete for these people to have a notion of what being Chilean was. But again, when you see local sources and people in Chile are asked, where are you from? What's your nationality? They would say Talca, San Felipe. They wouldn't say Chile at this stage of the game. Some decades later, this would change. And regarding international connections, you have a lot of physical mobility among the popular groups. People move a lot across frontiers. Between Chile and the River Plate, there's a lot of mobility. And I found many people who were enrolled into the Rosas militias, and they were asked, where are you from? Well, it's Valparaiso. And you ask yourself, what is this person doing here? But there was a significant amount of people that were moving around. And this, of course, tended to dilute even more the idea of national frontiers as we understand them today. So to sum everything up, I would say that at this stage of history, the nation was more a notion in the minds of state and nation builders than in the minds of the subaltern actors that I was studying. But as the state began to consolidate, the idea of the nation became more concrete, more clear, and it had to do with the presence of the state, basically. Whether you have to pay taxes, obey laws, enroll in armies, that made the idea of the nation much more day-to-day, even if not necessarily in very welcome manners.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat, which I will read out. So the first question is from Tom Rath. And it's, I have a question about the 20th century memory of these caudillos, in inverted commas, which, based on the cases of Rosas and Portales at least, was strongly associated with the political right. To what degree did that shape or distort the historical image of post-independence politics?
It's a fascinating question. Do I take it right away, or
yep.
will you read
Yes,
it?
please,
okay.
Go ahead.
It's fascinating because all these people in a sense, the three, I sort of personalized my analysis around three caudillos, because we are talking about the era of caudillos. And the book, in fact, is called Caudillos y plebeyos. So when I talk here in more abstract terms of ruling groups, elites, whatever, I boil this down in a sense around the figures of these three persons, Diego Portales, Juan Manuel de Rosas, Ramón Castilla. And it is very fascinating how the image of these people has traveled through the centuries, because to some degree or another, they're all recognized as state and nation builders in their respective countries. So there is a basic recognition that these people were instrumental to the earlier stages of state formation and to the earlier stages of the nationalities. But their images have become embroiled in later political disputes. And so they have also become symbols of much later day conflicts and political alignments. So for example, in the case of Chile, Diego Portales is revered as a figure by the Chilean right, to the extent that after the 1973 coup, when the presidential palace, La Moneda, was bombed and it couldn't be used for several years, the military set up in a different building and they called it the Diego Portales building. And they admittedly identified themselves as the followers of the Portales tradition. So they were looking at this period of history as, in a sense, a model of what they were trying to do again after saving the country from Marxism. In the case of Rosas, it is the other way around, because Rosas was execrated by the liberal elite, which overthrew him in 1852 and organized the Argentinian country in the later 19th century, but then was rescued, was appropriated by the Peronist left, and not only the Peronist left, but the Peronist movement in general. So Rosas became sort of a forerunner of Perón in the 20th century Argentinian imaginary, you know. So we had Rosas, who started the country in the right way. Then these foreign influenced liberals came in, kicked him out, and distorted the national trajectory in an unwelcome direction until General Perón came back and restored the Rosista project to its right place. So the evaluation, the assessment of the impact of Rosas on Argentinian history became part of the very 20th century division between Peronistas and anti-Peronistas, which of course does not very much aid to getting a less mediated vision of what Rosas really was, because to speak about Rosas in Argentina is immediately to position yourself in one of these two camps. And well, there are some Argentinians here in the audience. I don't have to tell you how deeply entrenched these divisions still run, and how high passions still run around this dichotomy. And in the case of Castilla, again, my feelings, my intuition was that Castilla, on the one side, is revered by the military in Peru. He is very much a military symbol. He is the one that finally began to bring the Peruvian act together after decades of civil war and turmoil, and build a Peruvian army, properly so, and not just caudillo armies, and begin the construction of a state in a period that was pretty successful from this standpoint, and which was cut short by the War of the Pacific. And in a sense, the feeling that I gathered from speaking to some military officers in Peru was that if Castilla has still been around, the outcome of the War of the Pacific would have been different. So there's this vision, but on the other side, there's this vision of Castilla as a popular hero, especially among the Black population. the Afro-Peruvian population, as I said before, they still cherish this image of Castilla as the liberator, the libertador, which he was. I mean, he was one who abolished slavery in Peru. And this is something that created very strong feelings of support and loyalty, which have transcended the generations and come down to today. And there's a lot of exaltation of Castilla in popular song, popular poetry, and popular culture in general, as the person who, the only ruler in the 19th century who had some concern about the well-being of the poor and the popular masses. So there's this kind of dichotomy: Castilla as a military hero, very much part of the pantheon of military heroes among the military. And on the other hand, Castilla as the liberator, as the popular leader who was the only one who had any interest in what was going on in the lower reaches of Peruvian society. So these are figures that have transcended their own age and have become part of legacies, which in some cases have to do with what they actually did, and some have little to do with what they did, but it's still significant that they have had this capacity to project historically.
Okay. Ernesto's question is really a comment, so maybe I'll just let anyone else who'd like to ask a question have maybe one last question. Anyone?
We have another question in the chat from Alessia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just read this then. From Alessia Masuelos: I understand you focused on Ramon Castilla for Peruvian caudillismo. However, do you believe that when acknowledging the personalism of government and democracy at risk, while having appealed to the masses, we can see Alberto Fujimori embodying the return of caudillismo? Fujimori was not completely authoritarian, but would you believe Fujimori marked the return of caudillismo in Peru?
I would not have the presumption to speak about Fujimori here in the presence of people who really know about that. But what I could say to that question was that I very much think that caudillismo was a very time-specific phenomenon. Caudillismo, as we understand it in the 19th century, early 19th century, had to do with a very concrete set of circumstances, which had to do with what I said earlier on, had to do with the collapse of the imperial system, had to do with societal structure that was thrown into mayhem to a certain extent, and where institutions pretty much didn't disappear, but they were seriously weakened, and so politics became very personalistic. And the role of caudillos has to do with this phenomenon of institutions. I don't want to say dissolving, because the word is too strong, because there was some survival of institutions from the colonial era into the Republican era. Legal codes, some bodies such as the judiciary, etc. I mean, it's not as if the entire institutional structure of the colony disappeared overnight. But we do have a serious weakening of the institutions, and we have a major power vacuum instantiating where before there was the rule of the king and the crown. So politics becomes very personalistic, more than following ideologies or doctrines. They have to do with very personalistic forms of managing power and managing politics. And that's where caudillos come in. People who have this capacity to elicit personal following, who also have access and control of armed bodies, which is the other major, this is something that Natalia knows much better than I do. Armed bodies are, I would say, perhaps the major political instrument at this stage of Hispanic American history. So if you have the capacity to control an armed body, be it informal, formal, whatever, that gives you a very strong starting point in trying to impose your political plans. So caudillismo is the incarnation of that context when speaking about the 19th century. And this is something that finally disappeared. I mean, the Latin American countries finally acquired some sort of organization, began to build institutions again. The countries modernized, cities grew, the economic bases were transformed. So when you get to the 20th century, you have a different setup where you might still have leadership figures. You always do in any kind of a political setting, even the most institutionalistic and democratic. Personal leadership still counts. But even though the name caudillo sometimes comes back, I would say that 20th century, not to speak of 21st century, leaders who are sometimes called caudillos have little to do with the caudillos of the earlier Republican period. So I personally would hesitate to call Fujimori a caudillo, even though in his manner of doing politics, you find some features which have to do with personalistic appeal. You have to do with ways of conversing with his followers, which might have some parallels with what happened in the 19th century. But I would say that I would not say that Castilla is a forerunner of Fujimori, if that is the concern of the person who was asking the question. Although it might very well be that modern day candidates to caudillismo would want to appropriate the images of these historical figures who are hallowed by posterity, because it might bring them political dividends. But that's as far as I would be willing to go in this matter, at least.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Julio. I think that this is a good place to stop the conversation. I just want to thank Natalia for her questions, and especially you, Julio, for joining us today, and everyone else who joined us and those who asked questions. Just to very quickly say that we have another seminar in 2 weeks' time when one of the conveners, Alejandra Irigoyen, will be talking to Daniela Marino and Ariadna Acevedo Rodrigo on a book about liberalism and indigenous communities in 19th century Latin America. So I hope you can join us then. And before we sign off, it would be great if you could turn your videos on and join me in thanking Julio and Natalia for a great session.
Well, thank you.